Japan in 1945 was an empire in defeat. While the Japanese warlords surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, an elite American intelligence unit known as TAI was combing the Japanese countryside in search of secret weapons before they could be destroyed. What TAI found, had it been ready on time, could have helped Japan snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. A secret air force of jet and rocket planes, aircraft at the cutting edge of technology, ready to fly out of hundreds of hidden airfields for what would have been the decisive battle of the Pacific. A massive strike against an invasion of Japan. This is the story of those Japanese X-planes, the aircraft that could have turned defeat into victory. In late 1941, a Japanese whirlwind swept across the Pacific. Allied fighters and bombers were obliterated from the sky. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, Allied planes were easily outclassed by superior Japanese aircraft. Shocked and bewildered, the Allies could hardly believe what they were witnessing.
It was quite a surprise to the Allies at the opening phase of World War II. They were used to watching videos of what was going on in China, and there were the biplane bombers and fighters with fixed landing gear.
Despite having received warnings from Colonel Claire Chennault in China that the Japanese had developed some very advanced aircraft, this seems to have been pigeonholed and totally overlooked.
A crushing blow to Western pride. Allied intelligence agencies had completely underestimated Japan's ability to design modern warplanes. The Allies now found themselves facing a technically advanced air force, years in the making.
The American reaction to the superiority of Japanese aircraft was to try and find out how they worked. But of course they had no intelligence gathering capability in Tokyo, in the home islands. So General MacArthur sends out a famous order. He says, go into the jungles, find the crashed Japanese airplanes, put them back together, make them fly, see how they work. And that's what they did.
A secret hangar near Brisbane was designated to store the aircraft. It was called Hangar 7, and in charge was an Army captain from Nashville, Tennessee, Frank T. McCoy.
I think he's one of the unsung heroes of World War II. He wasn't a flyer, he wasn't one of the generals, but in terms of saving Allied lives, his work in intelligence gathering about Japanese aircraft is one of the most important jobs of World War II.
McCoy's outfit was named Technical Air Intelligence. From its small beginnings in Hangar 7, it would grow to be one of the biggest Allied intelligence organizations, with units spread across every arena of the war.
It was really a grassroots thing and started from ground zero and developed into a major operation.
From the jungles of New Guinea, parts of wrecked Japanese planes were ferried back to Hangar 7. Parts from different downed planes were frequently and painstakingly pieced together to try and reproduce a machine whose performance could be evaluated. For McCoy and his team, the task was particularly daunting. Very little was known about the names and designations applied by the Japanese to their aircraft.
Pilots encountering airplanes in the air would report there were 6 Mitsubishis from 11 o'clock high, or there were Nakajimas coming from the south and all, and these really meant nothing to the people on the ground or the other pilots as to what kind of an airplane they were talking about. Is it a bomber, fighter, or a seaplane?
Frank McCoy and one of his junior officers, Francis Williams, came up with a brilliant scheme for getting around the fact that the Japanese own names for planes were very complicated. They decided with a brainwave just to call Japanese fighters by Western boys' names and the bombers and the transports by girls' names.
The people who named these airplanes officially said that there was no connotation to any person, place, or thing. But that's not always true. Take, for instance, the Betty bomber. I found out in doing some research on this that it happened to be a friend of one of the sergeants who was involved in the intelligence section of naming airplanes. There was a nurse in Pennsylvania that he knew of as Betty. And since the Betty bomber had large blisters on the side, it called to mind the physique of this young nurse in Pennsylvania and consequently named the airplane Betty.
But in 1942, as the Allies were pushed back across the Pacific by the victorious Japanese forces, finding downed Japanese planes was not easy.
The big problem became, how long would it take? As the United States learned that the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man, that they did not surrender, that to take an island, we literally had to kill every Japanese on it.
Technical Air Intelligence, TAI, began training crash intelligence officers to go into the jungle in the thick of combat to gather any scrap of information and equipment from downed enemy planes. It was one of the most dangerous intelligence missions of the war. Despite this effort, the Allies still lacked reliable information on what these planes were and how they worked. But in mid-1942, Technical Air Intelligence had a stroke of luck. In July, a lone PBY reconnaissance flying boat was on patrol over the Aleutian Islands. Suddenly, through the damp air, the observer spotted a downed plane, and it was not American.
The best piece of intelligence the Allies could have is an actual aircraft of the type that we were fighting against. One did go down in the Aleutians when the Japanese were working on the southern tip of that island chain.
It was a plane that until then had been known in name only, the Zero.
The Zero pilot actually was a new officer, very inexperienced. When he tried to land, he flipped the plane over on its back and broke his neck. So you had a nice, shiny new Zero, relatively undamaged with a dead pilot, and the Allies knew where that plane was.
TAI was back in business. The aircraft was quickly recovered, rigorously examined, and put into flying condition. In the autumn of 1942, it made its first flight in Allied hands.
The discovery of the Zero in the Aleutians allowed Technical Air Intelligence to reveal its secrets in combat. It showed the weaknesses of the Zero. In particular, the Zero lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, so if you could hit it, you could blow it apart.
This information allowed those forces to develop the appropriate tactics to use against the Japanese aircraft, allowing the Allied aircraft to use their best attributes and preventing the Japanese being able to employ the best attributes of their aircraft.
For the first time, TAI had a clear idea of the extent of Japanese technology. Data from the TIA units now began to help the Allies design aircraft to measure up to the Zero. The result was the Grumman Hellcat, and it would eventually down no fewer than 4,947 of the 6,477 enemy planes destroyed by US carrier pilots. But back in 1944, reconnaissance flights over Germany began to reveal strange burn marks on runways, a sign that jet and rocket planes were being developed that could outpace and easily down Allied fighters. For Allied command, the discovery was disturbing. Did Japan now possess jet fighter technology? US reconnaissance planes were dispatched to prowl the Japanese mainland to try to find out. The result would reveal one of the greatest near misses of the war. Just 2 years after discovering Japanese air technology was much more advanced than originally thought, technical air intelligence faced another, even more disturbing revelation. Unknown to them, the Japanese had already started developing their own jet technology.
It wasn't until World War II ended in Japan that the Allies knew that Japan was really ready to put a jet fighter into the air. This came as a great surprise.
The world's first jet fighter aircraft, the German Heinkel 280, flew in 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor. But it was the Japanese who were most enthusiastic about the new jet technology. For them, jet fighters were the key to defending the home islands against the big new American bomber, the B-29. But Japan needed help, and in 1944 it got it from Nazi Germany.
Germany was very influential for Japan as to the technology and the direction to go with jet-powered aircraft. Naturally, there would be Japanese figures in Germany working with the government, and in 1944 they made an agreement that Germany would share their technology with Japan. And among those, they found out that Germany had developed jet aircraft, namely the Messerschmitt 262.
The new jet Messerschmitt Me-262 was 150 miles an hour faster than anything else that flew. Armed with 4 30mm cannon and with a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, it could operate at an altitude of 37,500 feet, high enough to challenge the B-29.
Representatives of Japan in Berlin were able to acquire drawings, actual examples of the jet engine technology that had already been developed in Germany. They acquired the material and made preparations to bring it to Japan for the purpose of their own experimentation.
In the early summer of 1944, just a few weeks before the first B-29 raids on Japan from bases in western China, 2 Japanese submarines, the Satsuki and the Matsu, slipped out from Kiel, Germany, and began the long and dangerous journey back to Japan. But the Japanese codes had been broken, and news of the journey was immediately passed to technical air intelligence, who quickly realized the subs were carrying the plans to build the Me-262 jet. Allied planes and ships scoured the seas for the Satsuki and the Matsu. The Satsuki, with its precious cargo, was tracked down and sunk with all hands. But the Matsu escaped, and in July 1944 arrived in Singapore.
The failure of the Allies to sink the Matsu was potentially one of the most dangerous intelligence disasters of World War II.
Clearly, when the Japanese obtained examples of jet aircraft and engines from the Germans, or plans relating to these, their first source was to put these into production as quickly as possible in order that they could develop their own jet technology.
The Japanese version of the Me-262 was to be called the Karyu, or Fire Dragon, and would be operated by the Japanese Army Air Force. But the task of mass-producing the most complicated aircraft Japan had ever tried to build was a daunting one.
The problem the Japanese faced was how to get enough power out of a jet engine. They knew they needed special materials to run at high heats, but the real trick was how to compress the air that comes in the front of the jet to mix with the fuel in the right way in order to get the power out the back end. And that's a tricky mathematical problem, and that's what they got from the Germans.
Among the treasure trove brought back aboard the Matsu were top-secret photographs of a revolutionary new, high-powered German jet engine being developed to power its newest jet fighter.
The German aircraft manufacturer Heinkel had designed the HE-162 Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, as an aircraft which could be mass-produced very rapidly.
From photographs and drawings, Japanese designers managed to produce their own workable engine, which they called the NE-20.
The fact that the Japanese engineers were able to take a few sketches and a few photographs of a jet engine and build their own version is a tribute, in fact, to their genius. They weren't simply copying, they had to know an awful lot, they had to be really creative. And it just shows, even at that stage, how advanced the Japanese aviation industry was.
The Imperial Navy planned to use this new engine in yet another Japanese version of the German Me-262. It was called the Kika, Mandarin Orange Blossom. Its first operational flight was over Tokyo Bay on the 7th of August 1945, just 8 days before the end of the war.
Even though the jet engine was smaller and put out less thrust than the German counterpart, so was the Kika. It was more lightly built and a smaller airplane. So in putting the two together, it was assumed that the Kika could have been developed into a fighter or a bomber, very much like that of performance of the Messerschmitt 262. It would have been a major surprise to Allied fighters.
But jets were not the only secret aircraft Japan was working on. Designers were working on planes light years ahead of their time, and the world's first combat helicopter. Pearl Harbor was built as the Japanese attempt to assert its raw supremacy over the US. But in reality, the Japanese accomplished a number of strategic goals in the attack. Japan's success depended on its ability to establish and maintain a lifeline to a vital resource: oil. It attacked Pearl Harbor, in part to hold the US Navy at bay while it seized the huge oil resources of Dutch Indonesia.
Oil was absolutely central to the Japanese Pacific strategy. It was the American embargo on oil which had been the cause, effectively, of the outbreak of war in 1941, and it was totally critical to the whole Japanese war effort.
To prevent the Dutch from setting fire to the oil fields, the Japanese captured them in a daring assault by an elite corps of parachute troops whose officers had been trained in Nazi Germany. The coup brought the Japanese to the shores of Australia, giving them control over most of the Pacific. US forces immediately formed a plan to counterattack. Unrestricted submarine warfare would cut Japan off from its captured oil resources before the big formations of B-29s delivered the final devastating blow.
The American submarine campaign effectively blockaded the Japanese home islands, starved them of food, starved them of raw materials, most of all starved them of oil.
As America fought back across the Pacific, its submarines swept the seas clear of Japanese merchant ships. When the home islands began to run out of fuel, Japanese designers began to plan ways of outwitting the US submariners. The result was one of the most advanced designs in Second World War aircraft technology. It was called the Phoenix, a huge tanker aircraft designed to fly petrol over US submarines from the oil fields in Sumatra back to Japan.
The Phoenix project shows how desperate the Japanese were to keep their oil pipeline open. But it was a project born of desperation, because flying large aircraft full of fuel, and they'd be slow and lumbering through Allied fighters, was clearly a suicide mission. I don't think the project would have worked in practice.
Japan would need something else to break the blockade. In the home waters close to the Japanese coast, a lone US submarine glided in search of its prey. A slow-moving oil tanker, bringing its precious cargo back to power Japanese factories and fighter planes. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, came lethal depth charges.
The Japanese in World War II were in fact the first nation to deploy rotary wing vertical takeoff aircraft in combat. They used them for two purposes, for artillery spotting and also, dramatically, for anti-submarine warfare.
The first successful helicopter-type machine was called an autogyro and had its first flight in 1923. Dubbed the flying windmill by the press, the autogyro looked like an aeroplane but flew like a helicopter.
The autogyro was a primitive form of helicopter. It was a way stage on the way to the helicopter that we know today.
The Japanese were always quick to pick up on anything new, and in the early 1930s, the autogyro was that new thing. They purchased 2 Kellett autogyros from the United States, brought them to Japan, and evaluated what its performance capabilities could be, what use could they do with the autogyro. And of course, the military picked up on it pretty quick, understanding that this would make a good aerial observation airplane because of its slow speed and able to land into small places.
Shortly after delivery, the Japanese autogyros were destroyed in test flights. But the Army delivered the wreckage to the Kayaba Engineering Company with orders to develop a better machine.
When the Japanese Kayaba company rebuilt the Kellett autogyro, they did one brilliant thing. They realized that its limitations as a war machine was the underpowered engine. So they put into it a more powerful German engine, and suddenly they had a weapon of war.
Having seen the military application of the autogyro, the Army ordered production of these airplanes and acquired up to 98 of them. They used them for artillery spotting.
The first Japanese autogyro, KA-1, flew 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Despite its widespread use in the Philippines, its existence went completely undetected by technical air intelligence, so the machine was never even given an Allied code name. But as the tide of war turned against Japan, the Japanese Army would find another mission for the KA-1.
Strange as it may seem, the Japanese Army operated its own aircraft carriers as well as the Japanese Navy. Often during World War II, the two branches of the Japanese military couldn't get on and would duplicate each other's activities because they simply found it very difficult to cooperate.
The Japanese Army converted a number of transport ships into light aircraft carriers by fitting a small flight deck over the superstructure. As defeat loomed, these carriers were transferred to anti-submarine operations in the hope of protecting the delivery of vital supplies of oil. In April 1944, the transport carrier Akitsumaru was loaded with KA-1s armed with depth charges.
For the autogyro, it didn't have too much weightlifting capability, but by eliminating the front seat observer and putting a bomb shackle under that position, they were able to carry a 60-kilogram depth charge. And it might be noted that this is the only operational use of the autogyro that was used in World War II.
But before the KA-1s could go into action, another fate was in store for the Akitsumaru. The aircraft carrier transport was dispatched on a special mission, carrying relief supplies to isolated Japanese bases. On the 15th of November 1944, the US submarine Queenfish sighted the Akitsumaru. Silently, the Queenfish stalked its unsuspecting prey. the sinking of the Akitsu Maru put an end to the Japanese Army's experiment in anti-submarine warfare. But the Second World War would see other Japanese aerospace plans, even more advanced than the helicopter, far more advanced than anything the Allies possessed. On the 24th of January 1990, a rocket was sent to the moon. But this was neither an American nor a Russian mission. A third nation was now exploring deep space: Japan. The roots of its technology lay in the Second World War, with one of Japan's most famous aircraft designers, Hideo Itokawa.
Hideo Itokawa is famous in Japanese aviation circles for being famous. By that I mean he was the first person to step out of the traditional Japanese team structure where everyone was faceless and claim his priority as a great aviation designer. And to this day, many Japanese aviation engineers hate him for that.
1939, and Europe was at war. In the Far East, the pilots of the Japanese Army Air Force were testing a radical new fighter plane, the Nakajima Ki-43, Allied codename Oscar.
While the Japanese Navy had the famous Zero fighter, the Army had their famous fighter too, which turned out to be the Oscar. It was an airplane to tangle with, and in fact, so much that when Allied fighter pilots would meet the Oscar, it was not uncommon for them to call it so many zeros at 12 o'clock high.
Unlike previous Army fighter planes, the Oscar had a retractable undercarriage. Japanese Army pilots were used to lightness and maneuverability in their planes. They thought the retractable undercarriage made the plane too heavy. But Hideo Itokawa, in charge of the Oscar's aerodynamics, had designed something that would make the Oscar a fighting legend.
Nakajima designed into two of their major fighters a device called the butterfly flap, namely because that's what it looked like, a butterfly wing. This was a flap that not only was a landing flap and operated the same way, but it could be extended in flight when engaged in combat to add to the turning radius of the airplane.
In the battles to come, Hideo Itokawa's efforts paid off. The Oscar would prove to be one of the most formidable fighters of the Second World War.
As the war progressed, the Oscar was found to have a drawback. It didn't have the rate of climb, the performance of engine to climb up to catch high-flying US bombers like the B-29. So they needed a different kind of fighter.
That different kind of fighter was already being developed in Nazi Germany. It was called the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet and was powered by a liquid-fueled rocket motor. Discarding its undercarriage on takeoff for maximum aerodynamic efficiency, the Comet could climb to 30,000 feet in 2.5 minutes.
The Me-163 rocket fighter was designed as a point defense interceptor powered by a rocket motor rather than a jet or a piston engine. Its advantage was that it could climb extremely rapidly to high altitude to intercept bombers. It had distinct disadvantages, however. Its range was very, very limited. Effectively, the rocket fuel was used up in the initial climb. Only one attack could then be made, and the aircraft had to return without power to land.
The Imperial Japanese Navy, doubting that the Army could keep the home skies clear of American bombers, seized on the German Comet as a quick solution to its air defense needs. This Japanese version was called the Shusui, after the sound made by a samurai sword. Building the Shusui was entrusted to the Mitsubishi Company, designers of the legendary Zero fighter. On the 7th of July 1945, the first rocket-powered Shusui thundered into the sky.
As with other Nazi technology they acquired, the Japanese didn't just copy, they radically improved. They realized the problem with the 163 was that it didn't carry enough fuel, so they made it bigger.
This new and improved version was called the Type II rocket fighter. Fitted with delta wings for speed, it was to be powered by 2 rocket motors. Bigger and faster than the original Comet, and armed with missiles, it would have hunted the B-29s from the sky. The Navy also developed a manned rocket bomb for kamikaze attacks.
The use of the Baka bomb, the Fool, or as the Japanese called it, the Oka, was essentially as a long-range attack against the American fleet. In defense of the home islands, it having to be carried into combat by a Betty bomber would have been suicidal for the bomber crew itself. Essentially, the bombers would have been shot down before the Baka ever got within range to go on against the fleet.
As a result, the Japanese Navy drew up plans for a jet bomber to replace the Betty.
It was called the R2Y, or in the translation of the Japanese name is Beautiful Cloud. But the R2Y was never given one of the Allied identification names by Technical Air Intelligence because they simply didn't know it was there.
The first prototype of the R2Y was finished in April 1945. As its twin-jet engines weren't yet ready, it flew fitted with an ordinary propeller engine. The final jet version would have had 2 engines slung under the wings, making it capable of approaching 500 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Impossible for any US fighter to intercept.
You have to remember that Technical Air Intelligence knew nothing about the new generation of Japanese jet aircraft like the R2Y. Essentially, they were making the same mistake as 1941. They thought, well, we've stopped the German technology getting to Japan, so the Japanese can't do it on their own, and they were in for a big surprise.
How costly could this intelligence failure have been? Imagine if the Allies had been forced to invade the Japanese home islands. It is the spring of 1946. A US and British invasion fleet approaches the shores of the Japanese home islands. Corsairs of the US Navy fly patrol overhead. Suddenly, a Japanese supercarrier launches a strike of jet aircraft against the fleet.
The Japanese aircraft flying in from the home islands would have benefited from the ground clutter of the home islands. The American radar would not have been able to pick them up. They would have essentially been seen the first time when that lookout with his binoculars saw them flying in. And that would have had devastating results on the American fleet.
Flying too fast for US fighters or anti-aircraft gunners, the R2Ys would streak home, dropping torpedoes or firing air-to-surface guided missiles. Allied carriers would be reduced to floating hulks. Waves of Kika attack planes and R2Y bombers would fly out from their mountain caves to strike at the troop ships.
The planes would have come in with very short flight times and would have hit the most vulnerable ships first: the troop transports, the hospital ships, the ammunition ships.
But history had a different ending. The B-29s did indeed deliver the knockout blow that the Japanese had so feared, before planes like the Type II rocket fighter could be mass-produced. But one question remains. How had Japan kept its secret air force hidden from technical air intelligence for so long? On the 9th of August 1945, Just days after the atom bomb fell on Hiroshima, Russia declared war on Japan. The Soviet Secret Service immediately began to scour Manchuria for evidence of advanced Japanese aircraft technology. Not far behind was the United States.
At the end of the war with Japan, technical air intelligence units rushed to Tokyo, desperate to find out the state of Japanese aviation technology. In particular, they were worried that a lot of the prizes of Japanese invention would fall to the Russians, who had just invaded Manchuria.
But the prize was not in Manchuria. Just 6 months earlier, the Japanese High Command had ordered its aircraft manufacturing plants to build out of reach of United States bombing. Japan's mountainous terrain was the perfect place to hide. Abandoned mine workings and railway tunnels were turned into factories. New tunnels were dug deep into volcanic hillsides by Japan's army of miners.
Technical air intelligence discovered over 100 underground Japanese aircraft factories buried deep under the mountains. They would have been safe even from nuclear attack.
The Japanese military had calculated that even if they could no longer win the war outright, then they could make capturing the imperial heartland a costly venture for the Americans. The implications were enormous. Safely hidden in their bomb-proof caves, the new rocket and jet planes might have provided the means if they'd been ready.
They found a secret Nakajima factory with a production line for the Kika jet fighter, over 25 aircraft, well into final stages of assembly. And they found a separate production line for the R-2Y bomber.
Technical air intelligence had been outwitted by the Japanese one last time. TAI personnel found over 12,000 combat planes hidden in Japan's underground factories and airfields. A secret air force completely undetected by Allied High Command. Many of the most advanced of these aircraft were brought back to America and their secrets incorporated into post-war US jet and rocket technology. Back in Japan, engineers like Hideo Itokawa, the man who helped design the Oscar fighter, were out of a job.
By terms of the surrender, when the war ended, all aviation activities in Japan were immediately suspended. That meant a lot of people out of work, including many very good engineers and designers.
After the war, Itokawa turned to medical engineering. In fact, he was the first man to develop an artificial heart in Japan. But he was soon to be called back to the aviation industry.
In 1951, North Korea invaded the South. A year later, America signed a formal peace with its new ally, Japan. Former aeronautical engineers in Japan rushed back into jet plane research. The manufacturers of the Kika, Hideo Itokawa's old Nakajima company, also returned to jet production.
After the war, the Nakajima Aircraft Company changed its name to Fuji Heavy Industries and transferred out of war work, obviously, into commercial engineering. But when the Cold War turned hot in Korea, Fuji got back into the aviation business.
Nakajima Fuji built its first post-war military jet plane in 1958, the T-1.
Post-war Japanese aircraft engineering reappeared in disguise of American airplanes. These were built under license for their own armed forces through their own manufacturer. Among these were the F-86 Sabre that the JASDAF, Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, used, the Lockheed P-2 that Kawasaki built for the Japanese Navy. There were even later aircraft such as the Starfighter.
But one man refused to return to aviation work, Hideo Itokawa.
In 1953, Itokawa paid a research visit to the United States. He was still involved in medical engineering at that time, but When he got to America, he discovered something that he had never thought of before. He discovered the American space program.
Returning home, Itokawa relaunched the Japanese rocket program, this time for peaceful purposes.
By as early as 1954, Itokawa had tested his first homemade Japanese rockets. They actually reached an altitude of 100 kilometers. With this achievement, Itokawa became known as the father of the rocket in Japan.
On the 11th of February 1970, Japan launched its first satellite into orbit, making it only the fourth nation to reach space after Russia, America, and France. The Cold War made old enemies friends. It also changed the fortunes of Frank T. McCoy of Technical Air Intelligence, who returned to duty with the United States Air Force. The same problems, identifying and naming Japanese aircraft in the Second World War, had emerged with Russian aircraft. McCoy was assigned to NATO to set up a system of code names for Soviet military aircraft. He gave bombers names beginning with B, such as the Bear. Fighter names began with F, like the MiG-21 Fishbed. But these code names were never quite as romantic as those chosen for Japanese planes in the dark days of the Second World War, when technical air intelligence helped turn the tide of the Pacific War.
Modern historical research has uncovered the fact that Japan in World War II, with very minimal help from outside, had developed a whole range of advanced aviation technology: jets, rockets, guided missiles. It was a tremendous achievement.
Today, Japan is a participant in the International Space Station project, and there are plans for a Japanese manned space shuttle manufactured by Nakajima Fuji, the direct descendant of the Type II rocket fighter of 1945. One of the many secret Japanese aircraft that could have tipped the scales of victory had time been on Japan's side.